I want to first thank a couple organizations. I want to thank Main Street Eureka Springs for allowing us to do this programming. We have a class once or twice a month. And if you want to know more about them, you can find them on our Facebook page, which is Main Street Eureka Springs. We also have a newsletter, and if you're interested in that, just drop your email in the chat, but you'll be in it now that you're taking this class. And they're free and open to anyone in Northwest Arkansas. So if you see something that's not for you, but might be for a friend or for a family member, please let them know about it. It's all brought because of funding from Main Street Arkansas. We have a grant through them and through the Arkansas Community Foundation, specifically for COVID-19, being able to provide entrepreneur education online. So we're grateful for that opportunity. These are recorded, and you'll get the recording of this sent to you and for you to look back on, or you can share with someone else. There also will be placed on our YouTube channel, and I'll put a link to that in the email that we send to you. And then we also share it on social media. I am Jackie Wolven, the Executive Director of Main Street Eureka Springs, and it is my pleasure to introduce Darren. Darren Gibbs is a native of Fayetteville, but he's also, he's lived all over. I was looking at this, like you've lived in other places, but he's from Fayetteville. He's an attorney. He has his own firm. He primarily works in Washington, Benton, and Madison counties in Arkansas. He was brought to us because I asked Startup Junkie for a reference on commercial leasing, and he was the guy. So for those of you who are looking to lease or are currently leasing a building, I think it's important to know what the laws are and what you should be looking for, both as a person who's leasing and the person who's doing the leasing, the property owner and the person that's renting it. I think it's important. I know that in our own community, a lot of things are done with a handshake, which makes me tremendously nervous as a Main Street director. And I'm sure Darren will address that or not, but I don't think it's the best way to go. But without further ado, I would like to turn this over to Darren. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Let me see if I can. There we go. Hi, folks. Well, it's kind of hard to know where to start when you have a commercial lease issue, because there's a lot I could talk about, and I'm not going to talk about every single possible provision that you might find in a commercial lease. So, but I am going to talk about kind of just in general things to think about. Whether you are, and this will apply, whether you are somebody who is a lessor who owns the building or is a property manager, or a lessee, the person who is renting a space. Commercial leases are, by their very nature, almost 100% negotiable. So if you are a business owner and you are interested in renting a space, understand that if you want to negotiate the terms of your commercial lease, do it before you sign it. And if you aren't happy with your lease after you've signed it, both you and your property manager will have to agree on any changes. And so it definitely bears some thought and consideration into, and certainly review of your lease before you sign it. And often commercial leases are for longer periods of time. So you don't want to get stuck with something that could affect you financially, because business is hard. And so, let's talk about things that may be a surprise that come out of a commercial lease, and some things to think about on the front end before you sign one with someone. So I'm going to go over just what I've sort of picked out. I went over the last commercial lease I kind of helped deal with, and I want to go over just some basic terminology. And, I don't know what everybody knows. I'm not going to make any assumptions, but I've picked out several particular lease provisions that I think any business owner ought to know about, or at least have sort of a working knowledge about before you sign anything. And then after I've gone over some of these particular parts of a lease, I'll talk about some things that you ought to consider in negotiation. So we're going to have a little information and then maybe a little strategy afterwards, and then you guys can ask me any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. So a written lease is for a period of time. And in the commercial sense, it's usually at least 2 years, usually something like 3 to 7 years. And so obviously, you know, if you've ever rented your apartment or a house, those are usually a 1-year term. Rarely do you see one longer than a year. So already we're locking ourselves into a longer period of time for a commercial lease. And so there are some factors you need to think about as far as term. If it's a shorter term, you know, most commercial lessors and property managers are going to want to have you there for as long as they can help it, you know, as long as you're willing to stay there. And so you may get a lease for something like 5 years. You have to decide whether your business is ready for that type of commitment, whether it's the right location, whether it's the right amount, whether it fits within a business plan. So term is really important. The amount of rent you pay. I mean, rent is, in a commercial lease sense, it can be sort of a fluid amount, which is surprising, right? I sign up for a 5-year lease at $500 a month. That's all I should be paying, isn't it? Sometimes there are other fees that you might not expect. So let's see if we can try to figure out what those fees might be. But the other thing is, most commercial leases have what are called escalator clauses. So, and an escalator clause means that you'll pay a certain amount for the first maybe year or two of the lease. And then afterwards, you will pay maybe an extra percentage on top of that lease every year after that. And keep in mind that, you know, a property owner is trying to make a living too. And so one of the ways that they make a living is to fit their building with, you know, basically to match inflation or to continue to make a living and to continue to earn a reasonable amount on their building as time goes on. So if you're there for 5 years, the building may be worth a little bit more 5 years from now than it is today. So a lot of these leases prepare for that. And so you might see that escalator clause. So I talked a little bit about rent and, you know, maybe what makes up that term. And there are two types of commercial leases. You've got gross leases and you have net leases. Gross leases are an amount that you pay, and it's a fixed amount per month. And it includes some formula where the landlord is charging you taxes and insurance and, you know, maintenance fees to go along with your rent. So it's just one lump sum. Some commercial leases are called net leases, and there may be something called a single net lease or a double net lease or a triple net lease. And so it may be that as well as a flat rent payment, you're also going to pay a percentage of property tax or of insurance premium or of common area maintenance. And so that's where you might have a little bit of surprise if you didn't read your lease carefully. My $500 a month all of a sudden became $720 a month. Why am I paying more per month? Well, you're paying also a percentage of the common area that you're sharing with other tenants. You're helping the property owner to pay taxes. All of that should be set out in writing in a commercial lease. And just be careful. Just be aware that if you're aware of that on the front end, maybe you won't be surprised when you get your first bill. Security deposits. Most people are familiar with what a security deposit is. Sometimes you have, you know, it's either to secure the property itself for a period of time, and it's also to provide a landlord with a cushion when you leave. And so it can take care of property damage or other issues if you leave. Your lease needs to describe how the landlord can keep it, what they can do with it.
Question mark.
When you get it back after you leave. I mean, a lease should have that pretty described pretty clearly for you. The lease should also describe what space you're actually leasing. Often for a commercial lease, you are renting a piece of property by the foot. So if I'm going to rent something at $15 per square foot, I might want to have a diagram of the space in my lease attached as an exhibit. It might be something you measure for yourself before you sign the lease to make sure that the amount matches the square foot. Improvements, build outs, those are certainly things that get negotiated on the front end. An improvement or a build out would be what the landlord is willing to pay to help renovate the property before you move in. And so it may be that you have, I don't know, a restaurant business, or you've got a retail shop. You might be able to negotiate some money that the landlord is willing to commit to your property on the front end to get you there. And then you'll just need to understand how you are going to pay that back. And usually that's for a longer term of the lease. And if you have to breach early, it may be that you're responsible for whatever the landlord had to spend to get you there to begin with. So if I'm a landlord and we agree that I contribute $20,000 for a build out of your new property, it's a 5-year lease, and you leave after 3, I might want my $20,000 back, as well as whatever else is left on that lease term. So if you are able to negotiate some sort of build out, then you certainly want to be aware of, you know, how much and how it gets paid and when you might have to pay back. Insurance, there are usually always questions about insurance. Landlords ought to require you as a tenant to have some sort of liability policy. And so what that means is if somebody gets hurt on your premises that you're renting, that you have a liability policy that will cover somebody for their injuries. So if I walk into your retail shop and I fall down because somebody left an extension cord out on the ground and it shouldn't have been there, who's going to pay those bills? Well, that's why you have insurance. And so make sure that you understand what type of insurance amount is required, what fits your business. And then you'll want to visit with, multiple insurance providers to, either brokers to shop, because, $1 million policy could cost you $1,000 in one place. It could cost you $500 in another. So, make sure you understand what types of policies are in place there and what they cover. Typically, not all the time, but typically the landlord will cover the 4 walls and the roof. His policy, if there's a fire, the landlord's policy will cover the walls and help get those rebuilt, or the roof and get that rebuilt. It may not cover your stuff, your products, your inventory. And so you want to make sure you have coverage for that. And most commercial leases will actually exclude any landlord liability from having to cover your materials inside. So make sure that when you do have an insurance policy that it covers an adequate amount to replace your inventory and equipment and whatever else you have of value within your space. Utilities can be negotiated. Sometimes you have landlords that will cover, sometimes it's the nature of the building. The building I'm in now, my water is covered by my rent. And that's just because it would be really difficult to meter the various office spaces. I'm paying for water. I mean, that's part of the rent that I'm charged. But sometimes you get an extra bill for that. Sometimes your water is metered and you'll get a bill from the city for your water bill, or your trash bill, or your electric bill, etc. How your utilities are going to be paid is something you need to understand too. And whether you get the right to install your own meter might be something you need to think about. So if you have a business that is utility heavy, like a restaurant, it might be that you would like to control that. If you're a landlord, it might be you want them to control that. Other spaces, it may not matter so much. But just understand, what is considered a utility. I had a dispute one time over whether trash collection was considered a utility. And the landlord says, Well, the city of Fayetteville places trash collection on a document that they send every month called a utility bill. Therefore, trash collection is a utility. The lease, though, set out what the utilities were. I think it was water, electric, and gas. Trash was its own separate category. So we were able to say trash is not a utility. Trash is something else. You shouldn't be sending me a bill. And really the issue was my tenant shared space with a restaurant, and the restaurant, and I think my tenant was like it was a simple retail shop. So, the amount of trash produced by a restaurant versus the amount of trash produced by a retail shop is incredibly different. And so my retail shop was having to pay the pro rata share, basically an unfair share of the trash pickup. And so over the course of time, it ended up to be thousands of dollars over a few years. And so we wanted to try to put a stop to that or get some reimbursement. One of the things that would have helped on the front end is knowing what the differences were. And so just something to keep in mind. If you default on a lease, it's important to understand what happens and what the rules are. Arkansas is really tough on tenants who default on leases, commercial leases. If, let's say, I'm unable to pay my rent for the month of October, and my deadline to pay comes and goes, and the landlord says, I want you out of here. Here's your notice of eviction. And I don't leave. And so they have to initiate a proceeding. They go to court. They file a lawsuit against me and say, you got to get out of here. If I continue to remain in the premises, I am going to be responsible for 3 times the amount of rent that I'm owed on, that I have to pay from the lease for the amount of time I've held over beyond the eviction notice, assuming it was a valid eviction notice. So that's pretty tough. And I just think that's something a tenant should keep in mind and should know what all the rules are. Landlords often also provide a remediation period. So if they don't like the noise, or they don't like the signage, or they don't like something else, I think a tenant ought to have a period of time to fix it. 30 days, 15 days. I mean, who knows what it is. So, a remediation period, I think, is a good idea for things to help tenants anyway, and help landlords. I mean, if you want to keep your tenant there, you want to give them an opportunity to fix a problem. Give them notice of it and then fix it. Sometimes you have things, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a minute to more in more detail, but you might have an option. You may have a 5-year term with an option for another 5 years, or a 3-year term for an option for another 3 years. That's something that's pretty common in a commercial lease. And what that means is the landlord says, okay, well, you have a term of 3 years. You promised to be here for 3. I'm going to give you the first right for another 3 years. And there's probably a period of time in which you have to exercise that right. And so you need to keep those deadlines in mind. And then the last thing that anybody ought to know, and there are other things to know. I mean, I'm trying to give a summary here, but most commercial leases are personally guaranteed. So what does that mean? Typically, if I have a business, I go file, make a filing with the Secretary of State, and I get incorporated. So I'm Darren Gibbs Incorporated, and I'm going to go lease from, Eureka Springs Landlord LLC. And so my incorporation is going to be a party to the lease. But a landlord might also want me individually to be responsible for the terms of the lease. And so often you will have what's called a personal guarantee. And so that gives the landlord an opportunity to collect in case the business closes. I can still go after somebody individually. And it prevents tenants prevents folks from just opening new businesses without having to meet their other obligations. And so, in details of personal guarantees can be negotiated too, but you'll often see that in the commercial lease. Let's see. So a few points on negotiations. Longer versus shorter. What are some pros and cons? As a business owner, I probably want as short a lease as possible because I can't predict the future, and it's a lot less risk if I have a shorter period of time. The landlord, as I've said earlier, wants to keep you there as long as possible. So there's always a negotiation as to how long you get to be there, depending on the desirability of the location, the quality of the space, the type of space, your business. All of those factors are negotiation tools for the length of time for a lease. The build outs that we talked about, if I'm going to commit a lot of money as a landlord to bring you into my space, and I'm willing to commit $20,000 or $50,000 to you, I want you there for a long period of time, and you better commit to me. And so that's going to impact the length of time that you're there. It's going to impact, maybe the rate, the monthly rate. I may be willing to charge you a lower rate per month if you're willing to stay there longer. Before you negotiate a lease, we often get into this thing as humans where we fall in love at first sight with a location, or we think it's got to have that, got to be right there. That's where my restaurant needs to be, or that's where my shoe store has to be. And we might fail to look in the surrounding area to see if there are other possibilities. And so you want to know what the going rate is, call other landlords, figure out what they charge. If you can get into a place for $14 a square foot versus the $20 per square foot somebody else is offering, then, maybe you sacrifice a little bit of the location. Don't sacrifice so much that it'll put you out of business. But again, that's something that you need to know is what is the market really willing to bear there as far as costs. Various clauses that are tenant friendly. And again, I don't know how many people here are tenants versus landlords, but tenants might want to have the right to sublease or assign in case they get into trouble or in case they have a different business. Sometimes you'll have leases where the landlord has to approve that. There's some magic language out there that basically says that the landlord won't deny your right to assign unreasonably. And so a tenant might want to have the right to have somebody else come in and help them with rent or take over their lease. Tenants might want to have something called an exclusivity clause. And so what that means is you don't have a direct competitor in the same building. And if I'm a shoe store and I enter into a lease with a landlord and there are other available spaces in the building, I don't want another shoe store right next to me. And so I'm willing to maybe pay for a little bit of exclusivity, or it should be included as part of the lease. Make sure that you're, for signage, make sure that, make sure that you're following local ordinances for signage. First of all, don't build a sign that's too big and then you have to go build another sign. That happens sometimes. But the signage approval process, make sure they can't unreasonably deny, your signage or your marketing materials. You might look at the maintenance issues. What is a landlord repairing? What are they agreed to repair? How quickly will they come repair it? Typically, this is typical, this isn't every lease, typically the landlord will fix the structure. If the roof goes out, that's really a landlord responsibility because the landlord owned the building before you and will own the building after you leave. So the landlord ought to pay for the roof. Tenant probably ought to pay for everything that's inside. If a light switch goes out, if you need to get some electrical work done or plumbing work done, a lot of the times the tenant will pay for that type of maintenance. That's negotiable again. And so it may be that you have to notify your landlord before something gets fixed and you can negotiate that. Sometimes tenants are responsible for every square inch of a building inside or out. So you just need to be aware and consider how a maintenance issue would impact you. HVAC, always know that. You know, if the air conditioner goes out, how's it going to get fixed? Do I need to fix it, or will the landlord fix it? And when is that going to happen? And as a tenant, am I responsible for maintaining it? Do I need to have somebody inspect it every year? I mean, those are terms that often will appear in a commercial lease. And then, of course, you know, the construction improvement, you know, just make sure that you understand kind of how all, you know, what the terms are. If they're agreed, the landlord's agreed to maybe provide some money up front to help you to build out your business. Some sort of hot button issues today. I mean, what would a seminar be today without a COVID, you know, touching on COVID here and how that impacts your business and particularly commercial leases. You know, nobody anticipated a pandemic. I don't know how one would predict that, but I think the question now is, depending on your type of business, could you reasonably expect it to be closed if the pandemic continues? If I'm a, you know, maybe I'm a gym or a yoga studio or a restaurant or a bar, you know, it's very possible that next week the government comes in and shuts me down, and that's totally out of my control. So what type of provisions are we beginning to see in some of these leases? And, you know, a lot of leases were signed last year or 2 years ago or whatever. And so, you know, you may not see that in existing leases, but, you know, going forward, a landlord might require you to apply for government assistance, might require evidence of that application, and then might require you to pay the landlord direct. So if I go apply for the next generation of PPP loans that come around, you know, landlord may say to me, you need to show me your application for that money, and then you need to pay it to me when you get it. And if you don't, that's a default. Force majeure clauses are basically what that means. A force majeure clause, what that means is it prevents enforcement of a contract in the event of the unknown, some sort of unknown, be it a hurricane, tornado, act of God, riot, you know, all of these things appear to be happening everywhere at this time, right? So these clauses are definitely being discussed more than I've ever seen. And, you know, I've been in practice for 11 years now, so I've never discussed force majeure clauses like I have this year. So all of those clauses which describe natural disasters and riots and all, you know, damage to property and unexplained and unpredictable events. I mean, all of a sudden we're really looking at those. So usually from the landlord's point of view, if there is a force majeure clause, which would basically give the tenant a reprieve for a period of time until the event is over. Usually what you'll see is some language that makes it clear that your obligation to pay rent doesn't stop. Your due date may change. So, you know, if October rolls around and a tornado goes through goes through the neighborhood or whatever, and all of a sudden my business is shut down because there's no power for a while, you know, my October the 5th payment date, you know, I may get some forgiveness there, but I still owe the rent. And as soon as my business opens, I'm going to have to pay for the month of October. That's usually how those provisions look now. So you might get some reprieve, but you're not getting, you know, complete relief. The other thing that is becoming common too is a continuous use and operation provision. In other words, even if there's a pandemic and you want to close, the landlord may say you can't, you don't get to close, or you have to come up with creative ways to stay open. Really, we're talking about restaurants. So that means you got to come up with delivery service, curbside pickup. You've got to, basically you have to take whatever steps possible to stay in business and stay in operation. And there may be some sort of required mandate for reopening after your period of closure ends. So let's say if I'm a gym, you know, we've got these phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 reopenings, right? So gyms were closed right away. And so, but phase one allowed the reopening to a degree. And so I'm not allowed as a tenant to not reopen. I'm going to have to reopen within a few days after that phase one declaration. I hope that makes sense. Landlords want their properties occupied. And so, you've made the commitment to be there. So you have to reopen within a certain period of time. So a lot of those provisions are beginning to show up in commercial leases. Other than that, I'm open for questions. If you've got anything specific going on, if it's too detailed, you may want to call me later, but I'm happy to touch on a lot of questions and try to answer them as best as I can.
Yeah, you can just unmute yourself and ask a question. That's totally fine. So feel free. This is your moment. This is like an attorney that's free at this moment. Come on, guys.
You get what you pay for today, by the way. So
true. But if you have a question, I highly recommend that you take advantage. We have had, I will just say, in Eureka, there's a lot of leases that don't have a lot of provisions, and that I just, from my standpoint, someone who gets called in the middle of a problem will tell you that if it had been in writing at the beginning and agreed on at the beginning, a lot of heartache wouldn't happen. And really it comes down to things like he said, like maintenance. Who is actually in charge of the windows and the walls and the doors and the light switches and the HVAC system? I mean, I've just seen a lot of people really suffer because that wasn't clearly stated. And I can't say enough to have, if you get a lease and you don't quite understand all the terms in it, to go see an attorney or to go, have someone look at it with you. And also, if there's not enough in the lease, ask for more, right? Isn't that, Darren, can't you, as the person who's leasing, can't you say, I actually want this clearer?
Yeah, absolutely. The problem is once you've signed it, that's what it is. Unless you and your landlord agree otherwise.
Right. And
so, having those obligations made clear is really important.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think that just from what I've seen, a lot of it has to do with maintenance. These are old buildings. Honestly, historic buildings, and they require a lot of maintenance. The other thing that you touched on that I think is important. So we, several years ago, had a building that flooded. The plumbing up above flooded all three stories. And so three different businesses. And, a lot of insurance was there. There were a lot of pieces of that to take care of it. It was both the shop owners and their own insurance, plus the property owners. And those things happen. So understanding your insurance and understanding what's covered is also really important. We were lucky. Everybody seemed to have what they needed, but if they hadn't, they would have gone out of business. There's no way they would have been able to recover from something like that.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing that a lease ought to explain is who gets insurance proceeds and how those get applied. So if there's a devastating flood or natural disaster, the landlord is going to want to be able to take control of some of those funds so that they can get the building fixed. It's not personal. We just have to get the building fixed. A lot of those things ought, that process ought to be explained in a lease.
Yeah, agreed. If you all, local people, you look at Forest Hill that burned, right? So they had someone was leasing a portion of it, but the owner, was ultimately, his insurance ultimately covered the structure and the taking down of the structure. But I know there was multiple insurance things happening there, and it's complicated. And you're right. You don't want to think that your building is going to catch on fire. Buildings catch on fire. Yeah, so things to think about. And upfront, just upfront, I know we have a lot of I don't want to call them good old boys, but you know, a lot of handshakes and a lot of it'll be okay. But for
Yeah.
you as the small business owner and the entrepreneur, take care of yourself. I think that more importantly, take care of yourself. And also, if you're leasing, I see you, Diane Murphy, you're leasing some commercial space. You take care of yourself too. We don't want anyone to be, you know, just not have what they need if something does happen. So questions, this is it. Margot, do you have a question? Come on.
Margot's muted.
She is muted.
There we go. Now we go. Okay. So if you've done all the leasing and you've been in it, let's say a year, and you've got a 3-year lease, and the landlord decides that one of the closets or whatever, they don't want you to use anymore, can they just do that, or they breach a contract, or how does that work?
So I talked about space
Mm-hmm.
and defining your space and your square footage on the front end.
Mm-hmm.
And so typically your space is, you know, the 4 corners that you've leased. And that means that the landlord does not get to come in and tell you later, well, okay, I didn't really mean for you didn't really get that hallway, or you didn't really get that closet. But you also want to know from the tenant, okay, did I really have that closet to begin with?
Right.
And so having, you know, some of the, you know, Fayetteville's a little bit different. There's some, you know, big Manhattan, you know, property owners here that'll give you basically an architectural blueprint of some of the spaces here, you know, defined to the inch as to who gets what and where. But, you know, at least you ought to know what is included within the space that you're renting, and why wouldn't you put that in writing? That doesn't hurt either one of you. And the lease is all about setting expectations, and so having that that premises defined will only help.
So if, let's say that they still want to push and it was in your lease, would you just say, not unless you renegotiate the lease with me?
I think so. That's right.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I highly recommend the drawing. You know how weird and quirky our buildings are downtown?
Mhm.
I really recommend a physical drawing, and it doesn't have to be a blueprint from, you know, an architectural firm, but you know, you go in with a tape measure and you do that, because you, first of all, you know what the space is. They have to agree to that, and I think that's important. If they provide one, that's fine, but I would still then walk it yourself, just to see. I'm thinking of John Cross's building that's for lease on Spring. You know, that's 2 entrances on the front. It's multi-level. There's closets in the back. It's cut up really weird. You would want to know, do I have all that space? You know, what is that space? And also, when you're negotiating square footage, you would want to know exactly what that square footage is. And that includes the closet, Margot.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the things I didn't really get into that I want to is common area maintenance and common areas. So if you're a tenant and you're sharing one of those old houses in Eureka, there's 2 or 3 businesses in there. What are you guys sharing? Bathrooms, welcome space, storage space, and then who fixes the common areas? And you know, that's something that you want to have defined too. And not only who fixes it, but who pays for the fix. You know, is that a surprise bill that you get at some point? So you want to have the, you know, the guest bathroom that the 3 separate offices or 3 businesses share. We want to know who's going to fix that, and then who gets to pay for that. So all that can be set out in the lease.
Jackie, I have a question.
Yeah.
Let's say we're an owner and we want to lease space, but we don't necessarily want to serve as the property manager. What attributes do you look for in finding a property manager? And what is a fair compensation model for said property manager?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you want to know the other properties that they manage. You want to know whether they are primarily a residential property manager or whether they do have other commercial properties. You want to know essentially what services are they going to provide, and there will be a management contract that you can review. So that's not a lease, that's a service contract. As far as what's fair in compensation, it really depends. It may be that it's a 10%, it could be a 15%. It could be they take a commission from finding a tenant from you. That's really common. So, I think that it could be a flat rate, depends on the space. So you'll see all sorts of different compensation packages. That doesn't answer your question directly, but that's sort of what you'll be looking for.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Well, is there anything else? This is your moment. Well, I appreciate it. I have seen some bad leases and some non-leases. So I want people to feel confident that they can negotiate on both sides, and that it's just business, and it's just smart business. And also in our world, preservation, we want those buildings taken care of on both sides. Both sides matter to us because we want, the longevity of the use of that building is super important to the entire community. So Darren, thank you. We will send out your contact information. Sometimes questions are a little more complicated or private, and therefore they can reach out to you, but we do appreciate it. And again, you'll get the copy of this, everyone, and then what our next workshops are. We appreciate you being here. And thanks again to Main Street Eureka Springs, Arkansas Community Foundation, and Main Street Arkansas. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks. Appreciate it.
Thank you.